Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Dr. Margaret Toscano back on the show. We're going to talk about excommunication. Does it work to quash some of these progressive movements? We'll find out more from her in our next conversation, and I'll also ask if there's anything that intellectuals can learn from these episodes with Ordain Women on September 6th. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
So I don't know, you had a couple of questions.
Well, so because you did say that the excommunications in a way succeeded because while there was still a little bit of momentum at the time, it kind of fizzled out.
It did fizzle out, although if we're just looking at feminism, it reemerged in two ways. So one of the things I also don't like in her book is that she quotes Peggy Fletcher Stack twice when she talked about in 2003, Peggy did an article where have all the Mormon feminists gone? Mm-hmm. And it's true that I would see that as sort of a low point. She said they can barely get a handful of people at the Counterpoint Conference, as though that was our end. We actually, Counterpoint went on for until 2018, where Janice and I got too exhausted we had other things to do. But during the time of the Ordain Women movement, and even before that, we could get 50 or 60 people. So there's always been the low points like 2003, which was a low point for me emotionally too, which was my interview with Philip Lowenholm. I was in a real place of pain at that point, and that came through in my interview. But it rises again, and the way it started to rise again is through the internet. I always laugh. I don't know if Lisa still has the name Butterworth, but Lisa Butterworth was the woman who started the Feminist Mormon Housewives blog. And she laughed later because in 2004, when she started that, she thought she was the first and only Mormon feminist. She had no idea of this long history of Mormon feminism, right? And then later she connected with all of us, and I really love her. Again, I haven't talked to her for a long time, but the kind of internet started. You also then had the Ordain Women movement. There were thousands of people that signed put on, statements on the website for Ordain Women. People have said, well, thousands compared to how many million in the church, it doesn't really matter. But it does, I think. But anyway, I see it kind of going and up and down. Thing I think, go ahead. Rick,
I was just going to say they were successful in killing the Ordain Women's movement too.
Because they excommunicated Kate Kelly.
And I know Ordain Women still has a website. It's still around.
But it's really not functioning.
Exactly.
And so I would argue, and here's another great book somebody could write, if you think about Mormon feminism, and in fact, this is interesting to me, I think there have been more high-profile Mormon feminists that have been the target of the church than has there been a high-profile leader of affirmation? A lot of individual LGBTQ people have been excommunicated and injured, and I don't want to downplay that. But in terms of stopping a movement by excommunicating a high-profile person, I think it's happened more to feminists.
David Archuleta? Well, I guess, has he been excommunicated?
I don't know.
I can't remember. I think he left, but
no, definitely. The LGBTQ, again, the book I wish Sarah would write is how, the whole LGBTQ, how that has been, the dissent and movement and suppression of that and punishment. That's a great history, but it's a different history than the 1993. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there have been a lot of hype. So you had Sonia Johnson's 1979.
Which killed the ERA.
Yeah, although there's now a reemergence of Mormons for ERA. I don't know if they'll go anywhere. But then you had 1993, I was going to say that, if you want to continue on, I said Paul includes Michael David Wright, 1994. I think it's an important part. I don't know, we're going to start in 1991 and go to my excommunication in 2000. How are we going to do it? But there was another man, Michael Barrett. Have you heard of him? Mm. He was very public excommunication, another intellectual. He's not covered in here. He should be. Janice in 1995. Gail Houston, she was mentioned by Sarah in your interview with her.
Right.
Why didn't Sarah do an interview with her? Gail was excommunicated. Well, she was not excommunicated. She was not given continuing status at BYU in 1996 because she, I don't know exactly what she did, but evidently they said she had encouraged people to pray to Heavenly Mother.
Okay.
She should be in there. And then, of course, if you want to continue with the high-profile feminists, we could go to Kate Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. It dampens it. I don't think it'll go away.
Well, and it does seem, and I don't know, did the church, because it's not just Kate Kelly. John DeLynn is in that same time frame.
No, it's true.
Rock Waterman also.
Absolutely.
And so
and I know both of them, by the way.
I know Rock. Rock's great. But I wonder if you think that the church, in a sense, learned from 1993, and so when it came to John and Kelly and Rock, they kind of spread it out a little bit more so it wasn't all in 1 month.
Well, that may have been true. I think, though, that...
Denver Snuffer, I think, is in there, too.
Well, and I would also add, if she really wanted to talk about dissidents, she ends with, the BYU, what do they call it? The ecclesiastical church, what is it? There's some endorsement. They're really cracking down on, making everybody almost sign like a loyalty oath that you won't support LGBTQ issues at BYU. It's really horrible. And I'm glad she includes that. But if she really wants to show kind of a pattern of dissidence, I think the Denver Snuffer movement is extremely important. Mm-hmm. And also, of course, John DeLynn and the Mormon stories. Denver's been excommunicated, so has, other people. I think that, I'm not sure the church learned, I think the lesson the church learned is that they can excommunicate high-profile people and the church will go on. That right. Most members will not see it as that important. And although maybe they're losing more people now, I don't think that they think it hurts them. That for them, kind of keeping control of the discourse of the church is more important. I could be wrong on that, but that's my read of it. I want to also say about Kate Kelly, I was involved in the Ordain Women movement when it started. I haven't been involved recently at all. But I remember at first they didn't want me to be involved in a public way. They wanted my advice, but they didn't want me to be involved because they said, we want our image to be active, believing LDS women who are just asking the church leaders if they'll pray about women being ordained. But it immediately became sensationalized, and then of course, and they said, and when I said, you guys have got to be careful, the church will come down on you. That was my prediction. They all said, oh, Margaret, kind of patted me on the head. It's different now. We have the internet, right?
Yeah. They won't touch us.
They won't touch us. And then, of course, they did.
Uh-huh.
And, with all of this, I think another thing is that I said that there were hundreds of people that were involved in the events of 1993. But I think that you see, even going back to Sonia Johnson or the September 1993 or Ordain Women or other things, people do leave the church, and so you could ask in a larger kind of more community sense, does it hurt the church? I think it does. I think it's counterproductive. I think we could deal with these issues in a better way. And one of the things that I think is sad right now is how much polarization there is. Mm-hmm. That you have...
Well, that's countrywide. That's not just within the
church.
You're
right. I think it's not in the church, just in the church at all, but it is countrywide. But, I think it's sad that there's not a lot of conversations going between the different kinds of groups. So that's, again, why I like your show, Rick, is that I think you'll talk to people from, you talk to the sort of Mormon stories people, you'll talk to people who are still really active in the church. But that's very rare.
Yeah.
Most of the podcasts will not do that at all.
Well, let me ask you this, because we kind of focus on the church, but is there something that the intellectual crowd could do better? I look at Ordain Women, let's go there for a minute, and Nancy Ross, who was part of Feminist Mormon Housewives.
Right, I know Nancy.
She
I know everybody, right?
Is now the pastor for the Community of Christ.
Right.
So she is now an ordained woman. Brittany Mangelson, same way. She was involved with Ordain Women, and now she is an ordained pastor in Community of Christ. She is an ordained woman. And so when feminists, let's say, but I think it applies to intellectuals as well.
It does. It's not just feminists.
Could intellectuals, I know it's like herding cats, but
but we do agree on things.
But when the church puts the hammer down and you know, like with Kate Kelly, it really killed the movement, and with the September 6th, it really, I mean, it creates fear in the membership. To be like, well, I don't want to associate with Margaret. I don't want to associate with Brittany. I don't want to associate with, you know, these rabble-rousers. Is there anything that these groups could do by maybe staying more cohesive and not, in the case of Ordained Women, abandoning, and I shouldn't say abandoning, because it's still a group, but it's not.
No, it doesn't really have any,
visible.
it doesn't have power right now.
Yeah.
It's not making a difference. Maybe to individuals it is. So I have a couple of responses, Rick. I think that's a really good question. First of all, one of the big debates that's always happened in Mormon feminism since the 1980s when I was involved is the question of, should we work for little changes within the church, what they sometimes call baby steps, or should we try to go for the big thing? And of course, with women, the big thing is always ordination. And that's what got me in trouble. That is seen as the biggest threat. And that has divided Mormon feminist groups. Interestingly, when the first Counterpoint Conference, it was going to be sponsored by BYU Voice, Mormon Women's Forum, and Exponent 2. We wanted it to be all these Mormon feminist groups that were saying, why are you excluding Laurel? You know, right. We shouldn't do that.
And we should talk about Laurel. She's famous for well-behaved women seldom make history.
Yeah, she's a very good historian. Not just that phrase, right? But interestingly, as soon as we started organizing the conference, first of all, the BYU women were told that if they participated, they would be disciplined, or there was some kind of vague threat. So they withdrew. Then the Exponent 2 women withdrew because they felt like they had sort of a reputation for being a more moderate place where any woman could talk. And, you know, Exponent 2 magazine was always a really nice place, but it wouldn't deal with any controversial issues. So the Mormon Women's Forum was left, and we were always seen as the bad girls. And it was so funny because it was like, I never saw myself as sort of the bad girl, right? I mean, but as soon as so you had that divide between, oh, you're too radical, you're going to talk about ordaining women. You're going to directly criticize the church. So it's interesting, in the recent, there was the recent uproar, and I wrote her name down. Hand me that piece of paper over there, Rick, because I want to remember. So there was the recent uproar. Annette Dennis, in the Relief Society presidency, she gave some kind of a statement where she said that LDS women have more opportunities than women anywhere else.
Oh, just recently.
And there was just an uproar of not just, you know, feminist dissidents, but of mainstream women who said, really? You know, I have less voice in the church than I do in my workplace. So this was in March of this year, and it was all about women's empowerment. And Doug Fabrizio on Radio West did an interview with Jana Reese, Nyland McBain, and then another woman about whether or not, how they felt about this. And it was so interesting because both Nyland and Jana are still in the church. By the way, Jana signed this one thing way back. She had just joined the church. And
really?
Her name's on that, yeah. But they really discussed these same issues. And Nyland, who's always been the type who said, we can make change within. If we're just kind of, you know, don't be too radical, do local changes, it will all be better. And, some people have used the example of changes in the temple to say, well, look, that did help.
Yeah.
We've had a few changes.
Women can be witnesses now.
Yeah, women can be witnesses. We had change in the language of the temple. Women can, pray in general conference or whatever. There have been all these things. But then everybody says, but still, women do not have the authority and voice of men. They simply do not, if you look at the actual facts, right? So they did a really interesting interview where I thought it was telling that Nyland was a little more negative than she's been in the past, where it seemed like she was a little more discouraged, that she's been working on this for, 10 years, and just, have the baby steps worked. So that's one of the problems, right, is that you could say, how do you make change? Is it possible to make change? And way back when I was involved with the Mormon Women's Forum, we actually got a meeting, Kelly Frame and I, met with a couple of leaders of the Relief Society. And this was during the time of Aline Clyde and Aline Clyde, that's how you say her name, right? And Elaine Jack and so forth. And Chieko Okasaka, which was one of the best Relief Society presidencies we ever had. But they always said in private, we don't really have that much sway with the general authorities. And they listened to me and Kelly and were sympathetic, but basically it was sort of like, we've heard your cause, but we can't do anything. So I don't know, Rick. I'm sort of maybe hopeful by nature, and I think it might, that maybe we can make changes. But I think it's hard. And
would it help for these groups, Ordain Women, even the September 6th, to be a little bit more cohesive and continue to make noise even after the next?
I think, for example, that way back when the Mormon Women's Forum in '93 period, I remember talking to a woman who was a behavioral scientist and studied organizations, and she said that in order to make change, you have to work from both ends. You have to have the radicals that will push the boundaries, and then you have the kind of quiet workers within the structure. And if you have the ones, like you could say, well, did Ordain Women help to make those changes, those kind of smaller changes we've had? Maybe it did, because her idea was that if you push the boundaries, then the women over here they seem really mild. And then we'll do some of those things, right? We're not going to ordain women.
Yeah, we'll let women pray.
But we'll let women pray. We'll let them give talks. We'll give, they can be witnesses. There'll be changes. And then you have to ask, well, will it happen fast enough? Mm-hmm. So I want to go two other areas, Rick, before I know you and I can talk forever. And maybe these others won't be as long, and you can keep interrupting me. But I wanted to talk a little bit about her purity system.
Okay.
But did you want to ask me
Before
something else?
Before we go there, I do want to, because I want to follow up on what we were just talking about.
Oh, okay, good.
Because I believe it was Armand Moss, hopefully I'm correct on that, that as we talk about change within the church, and we have, prior to 1978, we didn't allow black men to be ordained. And I remember an interview that Armand did, and because there were all the NAACP was making a lot of noise, and there were marching.
BYU, I was at BYU at that time, yeah.
And Armand said we need to tone down the temperature, and so between 1972 and 78, there wasn't a lot of discussion on race, and that gap in rhetoric allowed President Kimball to work his magic kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think I disagree with Armand.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I also know Armand. Is he still alive?
No, he passed away.
Oh, that's sad.
I'm sad I never got to interview him.
I knew Armand as well, and I disagree with him in a way. I mean, I think it's true that, maybe it's somewhere in between that it helps if there's that gap. But I think really what brings about change is if you have a visionary man like Spencer Kimball and Marvin and Peterson.
Mark Peterson.
Mark Peterson is off in some
Brazil,
and you can vote while he's gone. The incident that happened in 1978. I was just Paul and I were reading in the Doctrine and Covenants that revelation. It brought tears to my eyes. It is so moving that change could happen. And I think it has really changed the church. We haven't gone far enough. There's still racism in the church, but it made a huge difference.
Oh, huge, yeah.
And I think, I mean, here is the, maybe I don't ever see myself as an optimist, but I guess that I'm a person that has hope. And I do believe that the Spirit of God works in the church and that good things can happen. Sometimes you have to have a leader die or be off in Brazil. So I don't know. I don't really agree completely with Armin, because I think, but I do think if you look at the issue of the ordination of African American men or black men, you have to have somebody in leadership who's open and willing to listen. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of hard. I think that's one of the big problems with LGBTQ issues right now. I think that that change will happen. I've sometimes said I think we may have more changes on that before we have an ordination of women.
Really?
I could be totally wrong on that, and I'll tell you why I think that. I think that if you look at church members that are maybe, I don't know where I should put it, under the age of 40, they are open to same-sex marriage, for example. BYU, in spite of all the controls the church tries to put on it, if you just look at the students, young people do not see this as a problem like, older men like President Nelson does. Mm-hmm. The world is different for them. So I really think that those things can change as, people who are younger kind of see things differently. I think the church will change on LGBTQ. The other reason I think...
When you say change, what does that mean?
Well, I think they would start with allowing same-sex marriage.
Outside the temple or inside the temple?
At this point, either one would be great.
Okay.
But I think eventually temple even, maybe. Because I don't think theologically there's anything against it.
Really?
No. But, that's a whole nother discussion we could have.
I might have to make another appointment 6 months from now.
Maybe Sarah will write another book and then we can discuss that. I mean, I do think that's the book I wish she had written, that I think she really is, that's the thing she's excited about. Which takes me, before we end, and I could talk forever, as you know, Rick.
Well, I wanted to let you go back to what you were going to do
about purity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about the purity issue, how she uses that as a framework, and then I want to talk about kind of a personal thing in terms of Paul and me.
Okay.
And then maybe if we get toward the end, this could be forever in the future, right, Rick? The whole idea of...
You're welcome to come on many more times.
What it means to be remembered and how we remember things, why it's important to remember.
Okay.
And that's kind of really my objection to her book, is I don't think she's remembering 1993 accurately, that she's leaving out a lot of people and events, and that it devalues the experience of hundreds of people that went through that because we don't have a record of it right now.
You're talking of like the Laurie Strombergs.
Yeah, the Laurie Strombergs, the Gail Houstons, the, who else could I put in that? Marty Bradley, people that are part of that whole, those experiences. Vicki Eastman, why do we just have people that were sort of the more high profile? Vicki Eastman, organized that whole olive branch experience and got the names and so forth. Yeah, so I am very concerned about that and how we remember things. But let's go back to the purity. So Sarah uses what she calls a purity system as a way of framing how she sees Mormon dissidents and so forth. And I just do not think that it works. And I think that the only place...
Because it's like doctrinal purity?
Well, and I want to talk about each one. So I don't think it works. I think the only place where it works is in the bodily or sexual purity. And that's why I think her ideas on purity would work with a history of LGBTQ people. I think that would be a really nice frame for thinking about it. But I don't think it really works for the others. I've already said one reason why I don't like it, and that is that it covers over, it kind of lets the church off with a sort of, I think it does, kind of like, well, every organization has to protect its boundaries and, so forth and so on. But I don't think it works. First of all, I don't think it makes sense. So she talks about 4 areas. She talks about historical purity, doctrinal purity, familiar purity, and bodily. I think her system only works for bodily. First of all, if you think of purity, you think more of like Jewish kosher laws or something. I mean, maybe, I think, again, with bodily purity, there is the language of purity in the church. But I think in the other areas, it obscures, again, the notion of the church's use of authoritarianism, silencing, forbidding questioning, and so forth, because it acts like, it doesn't focus on the right issues, I think. But let me talk. I mean, let's just start with the idea of, is there a notion of historical purity? So this is the question: is whitewashed history the same as pure history? I think that the language of faithful versus faithless or harmful is a better description of history. To kind of describe it as a purity system, to me, misdirects or kind of clouds the issues. I mean, obviously the church only wants history that they think is faithful, that's not going to question, although they're actually, I think, becoming more open on that. Yeah. If it's back far enough, let's throw Brigham Young under the bus for racism, right? We're fine with that. We can throw Brigham Young under the bus.
Except for, because I know Paul Reeve helped with that essay.
Yeah, I know another friend. I like him.
It sounds like, well, I remember when I interviewed Paul, he said, if you want to know what I believe, read my book. But it sounds like the church they kind of threw Brigham under the bus, but they kind of didn't. And when you read the Gospel Topics essay, if you're a faithful person, you can read that and say, no, God wanted the race ban. And if you're more historically minded, you'll be like, God had nothing to do with the race ban.
Right.
And so they've really kind of made that fuzzy.
I totally agree with you that they made it fuzzy, and that's a problem. They threw Brigham Young under the bus, but also I think I've had people tell me that, well, God must have had some reason, right, why that happened. And you might even argue, if I get down to family purity, I think Mark Peterson was he did not believe in mixed race marriages, let alone ordaining black men, right, African Americans to the priesthood. I think he did believe in racial purity. He was a horrible racist. And that is a problem. But so maybe the language of racial purity could help understand that issue. But I think if you're just trying to make everything fit into this purity system, it doesn't really explain everything. And I think it downplays the church's responsibility for their authoritarianism and their silencing. And that's kind of why I object to it. But I want to talk about doctrinal. I made a little quip here. I don't know if you like it. I said, the only one who's ever believed in doctrinal purity is Bruce R. McConkie. And,
not Boyd K. Packer?
Well, maybe Boyd K. Packer did too, although Bruce McConkie, and of course Bruce McConkie felt like he was the only one who knew what was doctrinally pure. But then, of course, he got in trouble for his Mormon doctrine book.
He was the expert on Mormon doctrine.
He believed in doctrinal purity. But I think that, and he had that whole talk about the 7 deadly heresies. I mean, heresy has never been a sort of idea in the church. You can be excommunicated for apostasy, but apostasy is not being quiet when the leaders want you to be quiet. That's not the same as heresy, where your doctrine is wrong. I mean, even with both me and Janice, I think that in the disciplinary councils, they would tell us that our doctrine was wrong, but on the other hand, they didn't want to argue about it. Janice, the stake president, said, well, you know more than I do about the scriptures. I'm not going to argue on that bit. This is just wrong, and I know it because I'm the leader.
Right.
Right? And I think the issue here is that with doctrinal purity, which is the phrase that the church used, we had to excommunicate these people because we have to, keep the idea of doctrinal purity. As soon as you have a notion of continuing revelation where one president can negate everything the previous president said, it doesn't really make sense that you're talking about doctrinal purity. The biggest example recently is, of course, the issue of whether or not Mormon is a bad term or not. Gordon B. Hinckley was fine with the term. He said, yeah, we probably prefer LDS, but Mormon has a great history, and he talked about singing the song, I Am a Mormon Boy, and he thought it was just fine. And then you had the big I Am a Mormon campaign. Mm-hmm. The church spent millions of dollars on that. And I thought it was a successful thing because the whole purpose was to show a diversity of membership. You could be a woman scientist. You could be in Japan. You could be a New York skateboarder boy. And you could still be a Mormon. It was very successful. But Hinckley and Nelson disagreed on this. As soon as Nelson becomes president, suddenly if you use the word Mormon, you're under the influence of Satan.
Yeah.
Is he saying that Hinckley was under the influence of Satan?
I mean, a good question.
It is a good question, right? And of course, I love this 19th century example of how, doctrinal purity has really never been an issue in the church other than from maybe McConkie and Packer. Who both think they were the only ones who could define it right. I don't know if you've ever heard, and I forget his first name. His name was Bunker in the 19th century. He first of all got excommunicated because he didn't believe in Adam God.
Oh, he founded Bunkerville.
Yeah, he founded Bunkerville. Later, he was converted to believe in the Adam God, and then the church changed, and he got excommunicated a second time for believing in it.
Yeah.
So he was an example of you could be excommunicated for believing in one thing, one thing at one time and another thing at another time. So I just don't think that idea of doctrinal purity really matters. Again, my experience and Janice's and Paul's.
Well, you're just a heretic with Heavenly Mother anyway, right?
I'm such a heretic with Heavenly Mother, and I'm writing a book about her, right? And actually, in my book, Rick, I'm trying to show that if you're real. I have to have another drink here. That if you're really talking about what Mormons believe about Heavenly Mother, it's from a sociological point of view, it's a spectrum. The general authorities will say certain things, members will do other things, and eventually, these things work out in interesting ways, right? Mm-hmm. As a scholar. So on the family purity, the only...
Before you go to family purity, I just have to ask because I just had some fundamentalists on. Is it Heavenly Mother or Heavenly Mothers?
Well,
are you going to talk about mothers in your book?
Well, I will deal with that question, and I believe in Heavenly Mother, singular. Although I would argue, and that's important because Heavenly Mothers... is kind of the concept of fundamentalists where you have polygamy, right?
Well, they date that to Brigham Young and Joseph Musser and that kind of
thing. I know. We can blame everything on Brigham Young, right? It's going to be, I'm really excited about my book. I think it's going to be interesting. Hopefully I'll get it published and so forth. On the family purity, she talks about monogamous heterosexual marriage. But is that really about purity? If you think about all the various...
Isn't it sexual purity, though?
Well, I think sexual purity is the one place where her model works. And you could say that everybody has to be chaste. That's one of the temple questions.
But from the church's point of view, I'll try to argue that for a second. You could argue that same-sex sex is impure.
Even if you're married.
Whether you're married or not.
No, and I think you're right that that's the position of the church. And again, this is, I think, why the LGBTQ is really the issue here. But even just here, I think it's really interesting. You're probably too young to remember all of this, but there's all sorts of stories about how the church in the past has tried to have, certain ideas about what's permitted within marriage. Like way back in the 1970s, there was the question of whether or not oral sex was that righteous or not? And then there was the argument about whether or not that should be a temple question. Mm-hmm. And I have a funny story, and some bishops, pushed it and others, but it was never official doctrine. In fact, I have another story that I won't tell about how Mark Peterson, with all of his sexual hang-ups, said, well, it might not be right, but you shouldn't ask it in the temple question. I have a source on that. But a funny story is that I knew a couple who went in for temple recommends. He went in first. The bishop asked him about oral sex. He said, "Oh, never." And then the wife went in and she said, "Yes, we do practice oral sex."
Uh-oh. Busted.
Or another funny story. I love funny stories because I don't like it all to be serious. And some bishop friend of mine who reported that he was doing a temple recommend interview with an older sister who was like 80, and he asked her the question about, chastity and everything. Do you have sex with any, outside the marriage or whatever? And she goes, "I don't even have sex with my husband." And she saw it as like she was a step up, that she was more pure. Well, I'm even better. I'm more chaste than you're asking because I don't even have sex with my husband.
Oh, no.
I know. I just think it's
Breaking
funny.
the multiply and replenish thing there. Right?
Well, she's 80, so that...
Okay.
No, my point is, though, that I agree with you as soon as you talk about sexuality, that purity is a model that works.
Okay.
But if you're thinking about, she's saying, well, it's about monogamous heterosexual marriage, but you think about all of the different patterns of that. I mean, people like to now think of it as like this idea of everybody back in the 1950s and 60s, it was like, leave it to Beaver. That was the only pattern. I mean, I remember back in my ward in the 1960s in Mesa, Arizona, we had quite a few women who were working mothers. And, she talks about, and obviously the church has always pushed the one thing, but I don't even think anybody felt guilty. It was like, oh, I have to work. And so there are a lot of patterns. I don't think it works that well, but maybe I'm wrong on that. At any rate, I guess my big reason for not liking, and she spends like 140 pages out of the book on her purity model, I think it covers over what I see as the real problems. It's not that the church is trying to stress purity other than sexually, but that they're stressing conformity, silencing, and authoritarian conformity. I see that as the problem. So I think her model covers over what I see as the real problem with the dissenters.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Margaret Toscano. In our next conversation, we're going to dive into the chapter in the September 6 in the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism that focuses on her and her husband, Paul Toscano. But it's only available to newsletter subscribers, so go to gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and I'll send you a secret link to the final part of our conversation. How have you changed since your 2003 interview with your
Philip
memory of the
Lindholm?
September 6th?
I was in a place of a lot of pain. In fact, I'm really proud of myself, Rick. I have not cried in this interview yet. Maybe I will cry before we stop. But I was in a lot of pain, and he even documents that I was crying during that interview, and I thought, oh, great. I get to be the weepy woman, right, who's overly emotional or something. But I was in a lot of pain.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.